Welcome back. This is Ryder Richards with Retail Strategies Podcast, Boots on the Ground. Today, we're going to be diving into one of the more critical challenges facing communities, and this is grocery store placement and addressing food insecurity. Now, to talk about this in depth today, because I'm not that familiar with it, is Elliott Cook. He's our Director of Real Estate, and he's been at the forefront of helping communities transform their retail landscapes. He's much more educated not only in real estate, but also in grocery than I am. And so I'm really going to lean on him today for his expertise. Elliott, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Ryder. Good to be back with you. Excited to share some insights and, really going to try to help make a difference in some of these communities we work with across the country.
Excellent. Okay, well, we've kind of mapped out some terrain that we want to cover today. And some of this is going to be things like data-driven site selection, which is something that's very important for real estate. But one of the things too is, how are we going to understand what a food desert landscape is? How do we define it? How do we look at that? And part of this is going to be, of course, overcoming some of these perceptions. Once we've kind of figured out what it is, there's certain ideas that people have in their mind. So sometimes we have to overcome those. Sometimes there's regulations. And these are all just things that are built into cities and frameworks. But what do we really need to do to develop a strategy to use real estate for grocery development? And so Elliott's going to talk us through a couple of creative solutions. Some of those are going to be backfilling existing spaces, but there's some other options out there that he has his finger on the pulse of. So he's going to walk us through those. And of course, we're going to wrap up with some advice for town administrators, community liaisons, people like that. So Elliott, I'll let you talk about this. Why don't you take it away here? How would we define something like a food desert? I mean, what does that term even mean?
Yeah, Ryder. I think food access, or the lack of food access, is a major issue across the entire United States. And this hits urban communities, as well as rural communities. This does not distinguish itself in only one part of the country. You can find this across every single state. Certain areas are obviously more impacted than others. It's a shocking stat to say that almost, over 47 million people are living in a food insecure household currently in the United States. Even though we have all this modern technology, obviously we have last mile delivery in a lot of places, or two-day delivery, and then access just, with grocery store expansion. I'm sure you've seen a lot in the news with Kroger and Albertsons or Aldi's expansion and whatnot, as well as local mom and pop grocers that are doing very well and have since the pandemic. There is still a major need. And when we think about public health, this is a major topic that is absolutely something every economic developer and then every elected official should be considering and very likely is considering.
Yeah, I find that one to sort of be interesting, right? Is the food secure areas end up having knock-on effects, right? Which is things like health.
When you think about food insecurity, I think food deserts, obviously, that's a term we'll be using. Some people kind of consider that a taboo word, and just the lack of food access. Sometimes that doesn't mean that there is nowhere to get food, but a lot of times it could be like a convenience store, or where non-perishable items are the only thing that people have access to. And from an economic standpoint, that's where they're eating in those places, or they're, maybe in some scenarios not eating at all, which is a major challenge to our nation. But we have to think about that. Obviously, getting fresh food items, perishable items to rural communities as well as underserved communities across the United States.
Yeah, and one of the interesting spots about that too is like convenience store food. It's probably not usually fresh. That's really not their main motivation there. But the other side of that is often it's more expensive.
Yeah.
So if you are in a tighter budget household, then your dollar just doesn't stretch as far when you don't have a major place that you can get to.
Well,
a supermarket.
Yeah, and then we saw this during the pandemic. The cost of food at home inflation well outpaced the cost of eating out, and certainly this is something we have seen a lot over the last couple of years, where for families that feeling financial hardship, which we've certainly seen a lot of that over the last decade plus, there are a lot of families who it is more economically viable for them to go through a drive-through. And there's nothing wrong with quick service restaurants or fast food restaurants, but on a consistent basis, a lot of families have figured out, or because of the financial situation with the cost of food at home, it is more, financially viable to go through a drive-through or eat out than it is to make food at home. And then tack on to the fact, if you're having to drive or, going really far distances to get that food, or just unable to get it because of lack of, ability with an automobile or whatever the case may be, this can really have a major effect on public health and, longevity and the health of the people in our country. Obviously, we know there are problems with obesity and sickness and whatnot, and access to fresh food is a proven way to hopefully, turn that back to, make our communities more healthy.
Yeah. How do we determine where we would want to locate a place that could serve as a hub for these communities?
Yeah. As we get into that, I kind of want to talk about looking at this and from a big picture standpoint. A lot of times when you talk about food insecurity and food access, there are a lot of things that people are doing, very positive things across the country as it pertains to community gardens, as it pertains to, food shelters or food, food banks, whether that's at a church or a community has that as, in their community center and things like that, which is incredibly important. But with what we do here at Retail Strategies, and certainly in my role as the director of real estate, I'm looking at this from how do we get grocery stores or retail brands that serve healthy, fresh, perishable items to communities. Getting more access there is an economic boost. Obviously, those retailers are very strong. They employ a lot of people. Oftentimes, they're paying good wages, as well as it is just essential and something we're hearing across the country from our clients. There is a need for more grocery, more diversity in grocery, and certainly more fresh items in stores. A lot of communities, for example, have a Dollar General or a Family Dollar, and those are great retailers. But sometimes the knock on those retailers is the fact that they don't have those perishable items. We're seeing the Dollar General do more DG markets and have more cold storage in their stores, and certainly we want to see more of that going as well. So I say that all to say, talking about site selection, which was, I think, your original question, this is an important thing to think about, and certainly at the heart of what we do here at Retail Strategies. We look at it from a data-driven approach, as well as looking at your community, looking at your county, looking at your region, and identifying if a retailer, if a grocery retailer, or someone who served or provided fresh food to your community, where would they go? And so having that custom trade analysis, that trade, understanding what your trade area looks like is step one. And if you've never had that, if you've ever heard me speak, or if you ever listened to this podcast before, you've likely heard us talk about this. But data drives everything in our industry. Data drives every decision from a developer standpoint, from a retailer standpoint, and it tells your story. And that's something I'm big on, is how are you best going out and telling your story? Because oftentimes there are perception issues around why that retailer has never gone there in the first place. Maybe there's not a grocery store because there is a perception that you don't have enough population, or you don't have enough income, or there are perception around crime and things like that. So having that data-driven trade analysis is incredibly important there. Mobile data. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just thinking, I have encountered some of these kind of logic problems before where, it's like, well, there's already not grocery there. That means grocery probably won't do well there, right? So there's this need at some point to find a way to retell the story so that people will relook at it rather than just sort of going off of assumptions, right?
Yeah. The big thing in our industry that we have to always consider is mitigating risk. There is a lot of risk when you build a new grocery store. Site selection is essential to these grocers and the developers that are their landlords are building these buildings for them. It is incredibly expensive to buy a piece of land or acquire a piece of land that could house a grocery store. Some of these grocery stores are over 150, 125,000 square feet. They fill those items with tons of items, and there is a premium for putting those items in the stores. Oftentimes they only have a couple of days to sell those items. If not, there's a big loss, to have things sit and expire on a shelf. The parking lot, is oftentimes got hundreds of parking spaces. They essentially have to have hundreds of parking spaces for that very reason. And there's obviously co-tenancy at play as well when you think about other tenants that want to be adjacent to a grocery store. All of this to say, this is an incredibly expensive endeavor. And what you're doing by providing data and providing real estate is you're helping mitigate that risk and proving to that person that if they take that chance, if they do, invest in your community, that most likely, if they ran a good operation, it would be a profitable endeavor. And grocery stores are extremely profitable endeavors, but their margins are razor thin. So they've got to get this right. They've got to get the site right. They've got to get the square footage right. And certainly they've got to get, things on the shelf and we'll talk about, getting those actual items to the store and turning them quickly so that they're able to sell it, you're able to eat it, or use the item, and everyone benefits.
Well, we're talking too about sort of overcoming these perceptions or maybe providing this new story. There are new forms of data we have now, right? Which we can really use to help pinpoint maybe best site selection areas.
Yeah. There's a lot of different sources that we use here at Retail Strategies. We spend a couple $100,000 a year actually on our data sources. And we know that these are the same data sources that the big national grocers are using as well as their developers. And, if you're familiar with our company, the brokerage house, retail specialists on the other side of our company, we're a landlord to a lot of these big national chains, as well as more local franchisee-driven, grocery store concepts as well. So we know that these are the services that they're using and they have to have when considering that next location. And once again, they can really tell a strong story. Mobile data is a big component of that, meaning cell phone data. And if you have a smartphone, your phone knows everything about you. It knows where home is. It knows where work is. If you have Bluetooth in your car, it connects to your phone, and it can tell you how far you are. It knows you're in the car, tells you how far you are from the destination that's in your calendar and all those different things. And this is an important thing to note because when we talk about distance from home, when we talk about where you're going, where your cell phone's pinging, and what apps you're using when you're at the grocery store, it really can tell a strong story of who that customer base would be or who that customer base currently is. So that's something we're leaning on, and that's something that we're using to tell the story to these grocers and to these developers about why they should consider markets for their next location. And even though there might be a competitor in the region, this is an important thing to show. Another component of all of this is saying that some groups don't have smartphones, some groups don't have access to an automobile. That cell phone data can also show that people from a certain area are not going to another grocery store. So showing that truly when we talk about not having access, you can see, and we've have examples of this in like Youngstown, Ohio, for example, or in Birmingham, where I live, Birmingham, Alabama, where you can see based off of mobile tracking data that an entire region of the city is just not going to grocery stores at all. So when you look at the grocery stores within, let's call it a 5-mile radius ring or a 10-mile radius ring, those certain neighborhoods or those certain pockets are not represented at all in those individual locations. So while it's important to tell the story of who's going to the store, it's also important to show why certain areas, when we talk about not having access, they're not going to grocery stores at all. And oftentimes, it's because, like I said, there's a lack of an automobile, there's a lack of public transportation, and lots of other categories and reasons for that as well.
The way I grew up was, of course, going to the grocery store as a family quite often. And so there's this, something that I sort of took for granted, right? And then sort of now trying to picture how my life would change not having access to it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's kind of mind-blowing. And then, one of the other things is we've talked about this probably before too, but there's different types of grocery stores that position themselves in different ways for different communities. We talked previously about sort of food banks and people that are trying to help out at the local level. And, there is something about not wanting people to have to rely on sort of volunteerism or charity in order to access food. So yeah, I don't know. It's a complex topic to get into. Like, how do you make this work for people? And of course, we have talked about the data and showing how that works. But what would be ways to pinpoint the location and then maybe take next steps into this story that we're talking about?
Depending on the grocer that you're going for, you need to figure out and something, no matter what type of retail we're trying to recruit to a community. One of the things that we're first trying to identify is what is currently there. That could be the Dollar General, like we mentioned earlier. Who's coming to that Dollar General? How successful is it? That's going to help tell that story to that next retailer who may want to move into the market as well. The fact that you've got a successful Dollar General, or maybe you're in a scenario where you've got 2 or 3 Dollar Generals in different areas of the community. Having that data is essential when going out and telling your story. And then, like I've just got done talking about, the viability that there's a population that is not served at all. We certainly have to talk about that group as well. But when we're working with communities, we're going to look at that custom trade area, which oftentimes, especially when we talk about rural and tertiary markets, they punch much stronger than they are. A lot of times their trade areas are very large. And they have a really, really strong numbers. It's just not reflected in their individual community's population, but their trade area is much larger than that. Then we're going to audit. Where is that corridor where if a grocery store was going to come to your market, where would it go? What sites are available? And that's a very important thing to identify. If someone was going to come here, where would they go? And we got to audit each individual property. Is their sites big enough? Are there scenarios where the grocer would like to come to the market, but the site's already been taken? Or maybe there's an old grocery box that's now a church, or it's, something else, and nothing wrong with a church. I'm just saying, is that the reason that a grocer hasn't come to the market? Because the box that they would take is currently occupied by something else. So that's all a big piece of this puzzle. And then going through and looking at all the attributes of each of those sites. We call it the universal site metrics, but kind of breaking down each opportunity and talking about what makes it viable for a grocery store, whether that's a signage component. Obviously, signage is extremely important to grocers. They want you to know every single day, that there's a grocery store there, and they want you to be thinking about the grocery store every time you drive by it. Parking, like I already mentioned, is incredibly important. Every grocer has to have that parking minimum. Obviously, they want it to be convenient for their customers. They've got multiple employees in there. It's also got to be easy for a truck to get in and out. And from a delivery standpoint, oftentimes multiple times during the day, certainly during operating hours, not just in the middle of the night. Another thing to think about is traffic. How easy is it to get in and out of the site? We are creatures of habit, and it's all about convenience. You probably don't realize this, but most grocery stores actually are you're taking a right into that property on your evening commute home. And so being that local expert when you're looking at sites and identifying that this site is actually capturing most traffic or is most convenient to enter the property during an evening commute. Even if you're talking about a community of 300 people, it doesn't have to be just 3 million people. Where are those 300 people? Could they take a right into the property on their way home from where the majority of them work, the area the majority of them work?
I mean, it is wild to think that we won't cross the street.
Yeah.
Like it's just enough of an inconvenience to have to take a left turn across traffic.
Well, I just
won't do it.
I say this all the time. It doesn't matter. Like I said, if you're a community of 300 people or 3 million people, all of us have been in a situation where it's 5:45. We're trying to take a left across traffic into some sort of retail establishment. It feels like it's 15 minutes. In reality, it's, 45, 90 seconds. And we kind of say, forget it. And we go somewhere else. And we very likely take a right into that property, which is the place we go to next. So, access is incredibly important. Once again, these grocers, they want you mentioned going as a family. A lot of people are going to the grocery store multiple times a week, not just once a week, sometimes multiple times a day. And a lot of people go to multiple grocers for multiple things if they have those options. And the thing to think about with a grocery store, if given the option, I know we're talking about food insecurity and food access, so this is a little bit different. When we think about food insecurity and food access, most consumers really only want to drive about 15 minutes to the grocery store. And what I mean by that is you're not going to drive past 3 grocery stores to get to the 4th, unless it is an incredibly niche specialty grocery store. But for your everyday items, Convenience is key. And then obviously the price point is obviously really important to you, or what you're looking for is incredibly important. So talking about those traffic patterns, talking about that convenience, if you're on the wrong side of the road, if you're outpositioned by one of your competitors, you're going to struggle. And so all grocers really care about all of that information. And ultimately that's why they don't enter some markets they would love to be in, is because they've been outpositioned by their competitors. And it's just not worth going into those places just based off of the fact that they feel they would do well because of, brand loyalty or whatever the case may be.
Are there any examples you can give where this, the story has been pitched or made to a community? Maybe somebody who didn't want to originally show up, an extra piece of information came through and it actually made them rethink their market.
Yeah, what we were just talking about, there's an example of that. Jasper, Alabama, Walker County, the county where Jasper is located, has been a longtime partner of ours for, I think, upwards of over a decade now. Aldi was a retailer that the community wanted, that we knew was interested in the market. We actually first approached them about attempting to put them in kind of their old traditional mall. The mall owner was interested and has since successfully turned that mall from like the interior mall of the 80s into where you can actually access it from the exterior and re-tenanting it and doing really well. Well, we pitched that to Aldi. Aldi actually rejected that site. And as we kind of went back to the drawing board, we noted that there was a former car dealership. And Aldi, to tell you, give you some kind of inside scoop on Aldi, Aldi wants to, they feel like their customer is the Walmart customer who doesn't want to deal with everything that is Walmart. Aldi's expanding like crazy, and they want to outposition, like I just mentioned, Walmart. They want it to be more convenient to go to Aldi than go to Walmart, because they think most of the time, if given the option, because of price point and the shopping experience, that you're going to choose Aldi over that Walmart experience. So they want you to have to pass an Aldi on your way to Walmart, which Walmart typically kind of bookends a national retail corridor anyways. So in this scenario, we knew that this former car lot was available for sale. It could be redeveloped. And even though it sat on the wrong side of the road, so basically the majority of the traffic would be, the PM side of the road, it was on the other side of that, the site sat at a red light. So it was easy to take a left across traffic at that red light and then enter into the property. It was a little big. We took that to a developer. The developer was able to get Aldi. They actually did an Aldi and a Harbor Freight Tools combined, and that has been an excellent site. But once again, it's all about talking about access, talking about the site itself, talking about telling that story. All of the things we just did, we put together that package and told the story about how that customer, it would be easy from an access standpoint for them to get into that property. And it's been a huge win for everyone, and all that Aldi's done very, very well.
That's a really great story about how telling that extra piece of information around real estate can really bring in somebody new. It's also, I'm thinking between Walmart's and Aldi's, then you mentioned a retail corridor previously. And if it already has a Walmart in it, that sort of means, I'm thinking about things like who has access to the food, but also do these grocers have access to the supplies that they need? So I don't know, how does a grocer like a Walmart, how close do they have to be to, say, a distribution network or something? How does that work?
Yeah, this is kind of the key component of all of this. As we kind of take, I've kind of mentioned in the lead up to this, kind of taking a microscope and looking at your community and saying, okay, well, let's figure out, what does the data tell us about our individual communities? And within that, where are those individual opportunities from a real estate perspective? When we look at the retailers themselves, whether this is, a IGA type brand, a franchisee, kind of local operator grocer, as well as when we get more to the macro of the big national chains, like we talked about Walmart as well. And then, the chains that we all desire having come to our community. It's all about distribution and figuring out distribution centers and where they are across your state is a major piece of all of this. And oftentimes what we see, especially in food insecure areas, like a rural market and whatnot, there's an interstate that runs through the county where a lot of these items are actually being driven through the county every single day. They're being driven through your market to get from site A to from the distribution center to probably more larger, markets that are more established from a grocery standpoint. So this is something when you think about the grocers in your state, and we think about the brands that you would like to try to attempt to recruit to address this issue, going through and figuring out where their distribution centers are and where their cold storage distribution centers are. Walmart, for example, has a cold storage distribution center. Dollar General has a cold storage distribution center, and then certainly the grocers do. Or they have like an associated wholesale grocers, they're part of an association where they get a lot of their items from. Identifying a lot of that and how far away it is. Every grocer is different. Some will go up to 300 miles. I think 150 miles is certainly a sweet spot. When we think about that, there are going to be grocers wherever you are, somewhere within a 300-mile radius ring from a distribution standpoint. How do we kind of focus in on those groups? How do we best try to attract them and prove to them that if they were to transport items from that cold storage facility to your individual store, they would be able to get it from point A to point B and then sell the item by the time the product perished, let's say, or, a gallon of milk or a head of lettuce or a loaf of bread or whatever the case may be.
No, that makes a lot of sense, especially thinking about the other day I was talking to somebody about a Brahms, for instance, because they have dairy there. And so it's sort of their distribution network is what allows them to sort of locate their stores. So thinking that distribution network is the hub and the stores can only reach so far. But yeah, if you're already delivering goods, well, then it's not that much of a pain to set up one more shop somewhere along the way. So yeah, that just makes a ton of sense. And yet it's one of those invisible things I never think about.
Yeah, well, I don't quote me on this, but Brahms, it's something like 4 hours. I'm sure there's a actual mile radius they put it on. I want to say it's like 4 hours from the dairy farm is how far. And if you look, every Brahms is within a radius of whatever the miles may be, or 4 hours of that dairy farm where all of that product comes from. Every other grocer, not from necessarily from the farm, but from their cold storage facilities and from their distribution centers. They've got to get it there. They've got to sell it because once again, like we talked about, this is a profitable endeavor and grocery stores are doing extremely well. And they did extremely well during the pandemic, which is why you're seeing so many of them either try to acquire the other brand, their competitive brands, or expand into new markets. And you're seeing a lot of really positive information around grocery in general. The reason for that is because grocery stores did so well during the pandemic. That being said, they've got to prove that it's going to be profitable in the new markets that they look at, and distribution is a major component of that. I'll also speak to a way kind of grocery is evolving as well. For example, where I live in Alabama, Kroger has entered my market, but they've done it in a different way. They've taken like an industrial complex, they have a warehouse, and they only do delivery. So this is the evolution of grocery, where they actually don't have any storefronts in the Birmingham area, but they have a warehouse where they will do grocery delivery. That's a much more, there's a lot less investment in that, and they've done really well.
I'm thinking that setting up that distribution network is a major cost. And so when I start thinking about that, then of course there's the idea that if Kroger does well enough, they might open storefronts in the future. But getting that initial component in place, it seems vitally important. And that also makes me wonder if that's something that a community could help with. Besides just providing the real estate, is there something else a community could do to help set up something like a distribution network or help out with these initial steps?
Yeah, economic developers or city managers listening to this, obviously, I'm sure industrial recruitment is a lot of what you spend your days focusing on. When I think about the future of grocery and when I think about communities and underserved markets, helping to get these retailers come to their market, a big part of that's going to be the suite of incentives, not to lose anyone that might be listening to this, but we are talking a lot about data. We're talking a lot about logistics, and then we're talking a lot about economics. And ultimately, this is all economics. And once again, proving that it's going to be successful. I kind of mentioned a little while ago that it is a major investment for a grocery store to come to a market or for a developer to build a grocery anchored shopping center. They're very attractive. They're very valuable. They certainly can sell them at a good margin, but the front end cost is really difficult, and that's a challenge that we're seeing across the country. So when we think about from a regulatory standpoint how you can be business friendly, how you can help with this is creating incentives, creating public-private partnerships, identifying developers in your region or in your state who have already been successful with this in other places, going and trying to talk to them. Who do they have relationships with where they could, potentially help recruit that grocery store, bring that grocery store to your market? And a lot of times in the current landscape, I'm not saying this is the only way to go about it, because we know there are other incentive programs where they make their money back over 10 years, of the execution of delivery of the shopping center. But a lot of times right now, just because of the cost of labor, because of the cost of materials, the cost of real estate, those kind of upfront incentives are the things that are making these capital stacks work. And those public-private partnerships, whatever you can do to sweeten it, whether that's obviously cheap land or potentially free land, helping with money on the front end to help offset a lot of those costs, that's going to make you stand out. Because ultimately we know that every community that doesn't have these retailers or doesn't have these grocers that, that really is putting a lot of emphasis on it, they're taking a lot of those recruitment strategies that maybe they're used to with an industrial standpoint, or these incentives, these kind of upfront incentives, and they're applying that kind of to the retail world as well. TIF districts are a great example of this as well. We've got an example in Tullahoma, Tennessee, where we helped recruit a Publix to that market. And I know I mentioned this in Jasper as well, to their old mall. It was the end cap of the old mall. They actually were able to convert a department store that had gone dark for a long time into a Publix. I mean, what's a better story with a mall conversion than that? This is something that's important. There's a component of this. Having the dollar stores, the Dollar Generals, the Family Dollars, the Dollar Trees, they're a component of this. The food bank is a component of this. The neighborhood gardens and community gardens, there's a component of this. Having your churches and whatnot help is a component of all of this. And we want actually having those grocery stores to be a piece of it as well. And we think we can be really helpful in helping you best tell your story. Because ultimately, like I try to tell every community we work with, if you don't know who is telling your story currently, how can you be sure that they're telling the right story or that they're telling your story at all? And especially in underserved areas or rural markets, oftentimes people are not telling the story at all. And that's a big component of all of this. So taking back control and having the right information, showing how it could be economically viable to open a grocery store, that's going to help you provide access to the people that live in your community and help your community ultimately be healthy and strong in the future.
Yeah, this comes back to being able to put your story out there is kind of a version of marketing and relationship building and making sure that you're incorporating other people within the conversation. This is sometimes it feels like it's supplemental marketing, but the idea that it can impact lives by bringing in something like a new grocer that can allow for better health within a community, for instance. It all seems like 2 or 3 steps removed, and I'm sure it takes a lot of effort to make that happen. If you had to give advice on somebody for how to get started in this journey, I don't know, Elliott, what do you do?
If you have a grocery store in your community and they're not fully servicing your community, there's a lot out there. I want to encourage you to look up the Reinvestment Fund, HFFI, the Healthy Food Financing Initiative. There's a lot of federal dollars out there that can help in helping these local grocers kind of rev up their offerings. There are great organizations. I'm going to give a shout out to my alma mater, Auburn University. I know Kansas State as well works on this. They have the Hunger Solutions Institute. They're doing a lot around food, equity, food access. If your goal is to go out and recruit a new grocer to your community, I kind of want to come back to some practical advice that we've been reiterating over and over again. First thing you need to understand is, do you know your custom trade area? Do you know who lives in your community, works in your community, who is passing through and driving through your community every single day, especially if it's on an evening commute? Put together marketing materials, tell your story, and then build relationships with the people who are making these decisions. I kind of have mentioned going out, identifying developers who have executed this in other areas. If you've seen a grocery anchor development in a market that you feel is kind of, comparable to yours, figure out who did it. Find the newspaper article or that community when they had a ribbon cutting, who was cutting the ribbon there or who was in that kind of lineup. Figure out who the real estate teams are for each of these individual brands or who their representatives are, their tenant representatives are. This can be really, really helpful, and having those relationships is going to be beneficial to you. Know your story, know your sites, know your landlords, who are the property owners who have the vacant box or have the vacant land that one of these things could be, built in or they could be a tenant of, and talk to them constantly. Identify who are they talking to. Has a grocer shown interest in the past, and why didn't it work, or where did it fall apart? And then go out and be proactive. This is a full-time job, and you have to be proactive in talking to these groups and letting them know that, once again, let's do all of the things we can from an incentive standpoint, from a marketing standpoint, from a data standpoint, to show that you've done your due diligence, to show them that if they took a chance in your market, or if they took a chance in this rural area or this underserved area, that it would be different than perception may have led them to believe, or why they haven't considered you in the past. Prove that it would most likely be profitable for them, and also, from a humanitarian standpoint, would also be beneficial to everyone involved.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that's so compelling about all of this, is that the humanitarian side of being able to help people and putting in this work up front. It sounds like there's a lot of community building involved. It's sort of interesting in a time of AI and technical solutions that you might actually have to go out and talk to people and get involved in that way.
And Ryder, we have talked about this on other podcasts, but a grocery store is so essential to a community in the same way that communities need healthy food to have healthy people in their communities who are going to last long, and they're going to be able to, live and prosper in these places. It's also an incredibly social place. People I grew up with, oftentimes the place I see them is at the grocery store. I know another grocery store in my community that has kind of like an upper floor mezzanine. That is the place where high school students go and study during the week, study for exams and whatnot. I don't know why they've chosen that place, but they go there and they hang out, and obviously they get, drinks and food and things like that. So when I talk about that, we've talked about this before, we certainly have other podcasts, which I'm going to give a plug to go listen to, about the third place. The grocery store is a component of, I'm not going to say it is the third place, but it is a third place for sure. And certainly caters to a lot of people, and it caters to everyone in your community. It's a place for you to see people, rub shoulders with people that you otherwise might not, as well as be nourished and hopefully be healthy and prosper within your community.
Yeah. Well, Elliott, thank you so much for your time, and you're just a wealth of knowledge on this subject. Is there anything you want to say as we kind of close out here today?
Yeah, I just want to, thanks for the opportunity, Ryder. And obviously, this is something I care about. I think a lot of people care about this. And like I said, this is a piece of the pie. There are a lot of different ways that people much smarter than myself are trying to address this issue. But certainly, I want to lend my knowledge and my past efforts to really address this issue. And this is the way that I know is proven to work. Once again, telling your story, leaning in on real estate, and then from an economic developer's lens, how do you put your best foot forward to grow your community and have a healthy community? And I promise you that this is a worthwhile endeavor. No matter what size community you are, no matter what your community looks like or its socioeconomic makeup looks like, you should be trying to do this to continue to advance your community. And there are people out there that are investing in this, that are listening, and that want to be a good partner for you going forward. If we can ever help you with that, please let us know. I'm sure my contact information is attached. And there are plenty of other people at our office that would love to talk to you about it as well.
All right. Thanks so much. And to anyone listening, then we're going to make available a PDF as a resource. It has a lot of the information we covered today. And that also will have some contact information for Elliott and our company.
Yeah. Ryder, I'll also, kind of final plug. We have a product that's called Grocery Academy within our Retail Academy blanket. It's something myself and my colleague Madeline Farr both uniquely work with. If you're interested in learning more about how you can best tell your story and best be more educated on going out and talking to these developers, talking to these grocers and all of these players within the industry, we'd love to help you do that. We give you all of the data we've talked about. We take a deep dive on your real estate, and then we educate you on how to best go out and put together a strategy to recruit a grocer or to someone with addressing food access in your community. So if you'd like to learn more, please reach out and we'd love to talk further.